Really, up until the Victorian times, we'd been basically an agricultural nation, and of course a bit of war in trying to, conquer half the world. And then along came the Victorians and the unbelievable engineering abilities that they had, and they all had tons of self-confidence, all these people like Brunel and Stevenson, and no doubt a great deal of faith in what they could do. I mean, some of the things they built were, at the time, bordering on, the limits of, well, nobody else in all the world had done such great things as what we did at that period in our history.
Fred Dibnah's heroes were the great engineers of the Victorian age. His interest in their work and his belief in the values of hard work and enterprise that drove them on shone through in all that he did.
Isn't Bard Kingdom Brunel my hero, I think today, in his honour, I shall wear this tall hat while I have a look round his ship. Really, if it had anything to do with engineering on a grand scale, Mr. Brunel were the man to have a go at it.
Perhaps every generation has to rediscover its own heroes from the past, and Fred's championing of the great engineers like Stevenson and Brunel is part of helping us to rediscover those heroes. And obviously that's worked. Brunel was voted one of the greatest Britons that ever lived quite recently in a national contest.
Whilst he was constructing the Great Western Railway, he got this grand vision to link New York with Bristol and the Great Western Railway. And this is the second of the three ships that he made. The SS Great Britain, which lies here now in the very dock that it was constructed in 1843.
He was able to spend his life among machines, among the buildings of the Victorian age, and he obviously identified very much with that, and that's part of the charm and the attraction, I think.
Here in my garden, I've got this lovely little steam engine which is almost identical to the one on the SS Great Britain. It's a lot smaller, of course, so it'd be easier for me to explain the engine of the SS Great Britain with this thing. Like, when Brunel first envisaged the SS Great Britain, it was going to be propelled by paddles. And of course, if you think about this, if this shaft went transverse across the hull of the ship with a paddle here and a paddle on the other side, it would be a paddle ship engine. But he kept the same engine, I think, and turned it round through 90 degrees. And on the SS Great Britain, this great wheel here ended up as something like 20-odd foot diameter chain wheel with a chain like a bicycle that went down to the bottom and went round another sprocket in the bottom of the hull, hence to the propeller shaft to the stern of the ship. But it is exactly the same. Two cylinders down in the bowels of the ship and the crankshaft practically sticking through the deck at the top. It's I've never had it going yet, this one, but I will do someday. It's quite an interesting sort of piece of tackle. I've not turned it round for a day or two. It's a bit stiff,
He read pretty well every book that was available, I think, on I.K. Brunel, who was primarily a civil engineer, of course, and became shipbuilder. But I think the one thing he did, which Fred had no intention of doing, was he worked himself into the ground. I mean, he died at 59 due to overwork. But Fred didn't believe in overwork. That's not to say, don't get me wrong, he wasn't lazy in any way. But if the job could be finished next week rather than tomorrow, it would get finished next week. But our job, it would be right when it was done.
So, was Fred anything like any of the great Victorian engineers he admired so much?
The other engineers, the more craftsman-like ones, the Stevensons, people like that, I think were much more like Fred, just down-to-earth people who were very knowledgeable in practical things, and it was that skill which then allowed them to become the important people they were.
It's Northumbria you've got to come to discover the early days of the railways. And of course, great men like George Stephenson, who were the pioneers of steam and iron. Here, on the Pockley Wagonway, which is situated in the Beamish Open Air Museum up here in the northeast, and recreated what the railways of the period actually looked like. This magnificent shed is a perfect replica of the Timothy Ackworth's engine shed at Shildon in County Durham, long demolished. And of course, Ackworth was the chief mechanical engineer and engine foreman for the world's first passenger carrying railway, the Stockton to Darlington Railway. And it was Ackworth's job to make sure all the locomotives kept going. Visitors to Beamish can have the unbelievable experience of travelling in carriages with no springs behind George Stephenson's reproduction locomotion #1. Hiya, you all right? The engine has 4 wheels, and of course the tender's got 4 wheels as well. The driver, his position when the thing's underway is up there, stood on the side on a plank, which is rather precarious. You know, he works all the levers on the valve gear that lets the steam into the cylinders. And then down here, of course, the stoker, he's got to do his business with his coal shovel, well, coke actually. And then when he's got it going and a full head of steam, he's quite within his rights to go on this plank on this side, but that's even more early because there's nothing to hang on to. I think we'll have a little trip down the line. Maybe not quite as far as Shildon to Stockton, but nevertheless it'll be quite an experience. Right, my mate, are we ready? Like all early locomotives, it had no brakes, you know, like to stop the thing, the fireman had to actually jump off and pin down the brakes on the coal wagons, you know. Quite an early occupation.
I said to him on a few times, I said, you know, if you had been born 50 years ago, you wouldn't be interested in steam engines, you'd have been interested in horses. Before the days of steam, I said, steam engines, if you'd have been born when you think you would like to have been born, they would have represented modern technology, and I don't think you'd have been interested in modern technology.
On the opening day, George Stephenson actually drove the locomotive, and his 2 brothers acted as firemen. I mean, it must have been quite exciting, really, when you think about it. I suppose it equivalent to being an airline pilot.
If Fred had been born in the 19th century, he'd have been there chatting with Stephenson about his ideas and thoughts. Stephenson was very much into the latest thing, not just railways, he was into all sorts of different scientific and technological ideas, and I think that would have appealed to Fred. Fred raised the profile of the great engineers in a very accessible way. He took them out of the realms of the history books, he took them away from the dry open university academics in the tweed suits, and he took them and made them alive. You only have to look at a lot of the programmes that he made to see that this man actually knew what he was talking about, as well as, you know, just going around doing the business. He knew about these guys, he knew about their lives, he knew about their achievements.
It's got lovely boil joints on it, so, you know, there's no friction really ever. It'll all go about in its ponderous way without rubbing on each corner of a straight bearing.
And he thought what they were doing was fantastic. He admired their ability to think on their feet, he admired their ability to take risks and do things that they thought were unthinkable. George Stephenson once said, I will do something that is going to astonish the whole world, and I think Fred would have agreed with that wholeheartedly.
This is a replica of the world-famous Stephenson's rocket, and they're going to let me have a go on it. I'm really looking forward to it, I'll tell you. Now then, what are you doing, mate? I'm really looking forward to this.
Aye.
Yeah.
Well, let's see if we can get the thing underway. Oh, you're up, Fred.
Yeah, everything okay, man. Yeah.
quite long-legged, Fred. You can imagine, keep it going. Yeah. And he seemed to like the idea of 4'7" or 47. The wheels are 47 in that time.
Fred made it much easier to understand. He, how shall we say, was one of us, as it were. He was a man off the street. He was somebody born in Bolton, Lancashire. He had no pretensions of going to college. He was a straightforward, down-to-earth man.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're just going over the crossing on
And he understood things on his level, and he had a great ability to communicate that understanding in a way that the layman, person on the street, person watching his programmes, could just communicate with and just see what he was talking about rather than get tangled up in academia.
Most unbelievable reversing gear I've ever played with.
steam, Fred. Yeah. We're coming up to the buffers.
To stop it, you're basically banging in reverse.
Don't try it with your Ford Fiesta, Fred. Don't try it with a Ford Fiesta.
No. The world's first successful passenger engine.
Yeah. Imagine what other people would think when they thought... Yeah, they were saying that your lungs would collapse with such speed and stuff like this.
In fact, one man who actually drove this thing, I've read in an history book somewhere that he got so uptight about it, he asked for it to be taken off the job, you know. It went too fast at 35 miles an hour. Here, inside the museum, they have a full-size cutaway replica of the rocket. And you can actually see how the features of it, even in the most modern locomotive, steam locomotive, all the main features have never ever altered, you know. Like this is the exhaust pipe or the blast pipe, there's one on each side, which makes the locomotive woof, woof, woof.
When Fred talks about people like Brunel and Stevenson, he's excited by them because they don't just work with their head, they could work with their hands, and they knew how machines operated, they knew what it took to make them run smoothly. He knew that they were excited about the mechanics, the insides of machines.
This engine here behind me is the only long-boilered tender mainline engine in existence, and it's a design that were done by Robert Stevenson in the 1830s. I mean, this were made quite a lot later, you know, but it's the basic shape of it, inside cylinders and 6 wheels, had been around since 1830. When you really look at it and you compare it with the rocket, which were 1829, you know, rapid advances were made in a very short time, you know, to a thing as big as this, from something like Stephenson's rocket, which of course is only half the size of it. Robert Stevenson and his company, of course, didn't just build locomotives, you know, they built the lines and the bridges and all the engineering works involved in the construction of a full-size railway. Newcastle's high-level bridge was designed by Robert Stevenson and opened in 1849 by Queen Victoria. And it's rather an interesting structure, really, when you think. Like, of course, it's basically made of cast iron arches with wrought iron tie rods stiffening it all up, and it stands on 5 sandstone pillars. But the interesting bit is the railway is on the top and the roadway is underneath. And when you think, really, it's a credit to Mr. Stevenson. It's still here today and still functioning quite well. And of course, when you think of the weight of all the stuff that goes over it, railway trains are much heavier now than they were in 1849. Motor cars have replaced horses and carriages, which of course are heavier, and motor wagons, and it's still going strong. It's a credit to him, really.
He was very comfortable with the things the Victorians had made. He liked their technology. He liked the way they expressed themselves. I think he liked their confidence. And I think if you went back to Victorian times, you would have found a lot of people like Fred.
And this is the sort of place they might have worked. Robert Stevenson's locomotive works in Newcastle.
This is the visitor's staircase, where people like Brunel and Daniel Gooch would come when they were doing deals. It leads up to Mr. Stevenson's private office. So there you're in near the drawing office. Yeah. This is Mr. Stevenson's personal office. How sad, eh? A bit of Cornish mould left and half a fireplace. And these lovely windows with beautiful narrow sash bars, you know. And even the shutters still work. It's all really good quality joinery in this, you know. And I know, living in a house that were built in 1850s, that all of this is right for that period. You know, yeah. I do hope they can raise enough money and restore it to its past glory. Next door here, through in this drawing office, you can imagine them all scratching away, drawing four-wheel locomotives for the world market, as you might say.
Undoubtedly, the great British engineers who built the empire, you know, Fred was not a great man for political correctness, and would talk about the colonies, referring to America and other parts of the world that we, you know, we built the world's railways, if you like, and Fred would talk endlessly about that. And I think they were the sort of people who he really admired. They were his heroes from boyhood days, I would imagine.
This, of course, was the drawing office, you know, where I suppose all the early locomotives from England, most of them were possibly designed here. And of course, all that lot there were all filled in with windows. And then down below the assembly shop, you know, they got to have it locked in because the muck had come up. And I suppose there'd be a constant supply up these stairs of people wanting to know measurements and different dimensions for the bits they were machining downstairs. Down here, this is where the locomotives were actually assembled. You know, I like places like this. You can imagine, you know, in 1836 or something like that, you know, they'd be really going hammer and tongs in here, all the beautiful, shiny brass and copper, you know. Over here, there were a great, big, long, flat belt-driven lathes, and some smaller ones at the end, which possibly were used for doing the finer bits of brackets and bits and pieces. Somewhere very nearby, in a building similar to this, they would have had the foundry, where the wheels, the cylinders, and small sort of brackets that were nearly always under compression that would be cast. And then, of course, they'd come here to be machined over there against that wall, and then be assembled on the locomotive that were being constructed.
Victorian engineers and men of that ilk, miners, and workers in factories, anybody with any degree of skill, was somebody in Fred's mind that deserved recognition because they didn't mind getting their hands dirty. They suffered, you know, there was great toil in the old days and suffering, and Fred, he had an empathy with that, really.
Here at the Victorian Iron Foundry at Ironbridge Gorge Museum, you can actually see how they would have cast a locomotive wheel in like the mid-Victorian period. In fact, all the bits of steam locomotive that were made of cast iron, like the funnel, the brake box, the blast pipe, you know, there were a heck of a lot of cast iron in a locomotive. But the wheel is the main thing, really. It went very well, that, very smoothly, didn't it? You know, you see how the molten metal ran from the pouring hole and all the way around and then into the centre. And then how it sunk in the middle, you know, they do that, and got to keep putting a bit on in the middle. Yeah, I think I'd better move on because my trousers are nearly on fire. Bloody hell. All right.
It was these people who made Britain great, and I think that was for many years forgotten. There's been this recent revitalisation, the idea that, you know, it's okay to say Britain was industrially mighty. It's not politically incorrect to say that anymore. And I think there was certainly a phase we saw, you know, where we felt guilty about our empire and our aspirations for world domination. You know, people like Brunel, Hackworth, certainly, you know, the Stevensons, we've kind of reinterpreted their importance and their roles. And all of these people contributed to that kind of industrial knowledge that people like Fred would, you know, recreate in their garden.
All right. Right, really, the equipment that they had, or would have had in Robert Stevenson's place up in Newcastle on Tyne, wouldn't have been a great deal different than this, and it would be definitely driven from a line shaft by a steam engine. I mean, even the drills, they'd be almost identical, apart from maybe the gears would be exposed, you know, make even more row than this. I mean, when you think about it, it was a superb job, you know. It's very slow, though, compared with modern equipment. I mean, they'd have used it for you know, boring all the brackets and bits and pieces for the motion of a locomotive. I mean, they'd have had bigger versions for, you know, drilling holes in ends of cranks and things like that.
Fred's main interest is steam. All the machines that he uses and loves are driven by steam, and steam was the driving medium of the Victorian age. So I think he sees himself as a contemporary of the likes of Stephenson, Hackworth, Brunel in the big steam age. He's raised their awareness tremendously. I mean, he mentions them in all his programmes. They're obviously his heroes of the past, and they would be forgotten if it wasn't for people like Fred, who remind us of the contribution that they made to our industrial heritage.
I think he brought the whole story of Britain's great industrial development to people's awareness, and particularly through some of the famous people involved, the Stephensons, the Hackworths, etc. But it probably too came over that there were a lot of people like him in the Victorian era who, through their graft and through their work, got Britain to be where it was as a leading industrial nation.
And one of them was the great Victorian industrialist, Sir William Armstrong.
William Armstrong really were actually a lawyer. He studied the law, you know, but he had this other interest in science and technology, and of course one of his great things were hydraulics. It's an astonishing fact that Armstrong never had any formal training in engineering, you know. Everything he knew he taught himself. And at the beginning of his company, for the first 15 years, he never had a holiday, you know, a bit like me, really. And of course, like Brunel, he like were dedicated to the job, you know. I mean, if there were a great problem wanted solving, you know, he didn't even go home, you know, he would sleep on the job.
There have been a number of biographies of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who's much the most famous engineer in history, perhaps too famous, some would say. There's been one biography of George and Robert Stephenson and one of Robert Stephenson. There hasn't yet been a proper biography of Sir William Armstrong at all. Their names, which are were known to maybe, you know, in the order of 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 people. But after Fred's programmes, their names were known to several million people, which is a huge contribution in public education, if you think about it.
By 1847, Armstrong had given up practicing law. He opened his Elsick Works on the banks of the River Tyne, where he manufactured hydraulic cranes and all sorts of other engineering equipment like lathes and steam engines and steam pumps. The business was a huge success and went on to provide engines and hydraulic machinery for some of the greatest civil engineering projects of the Victorian age, including Tower Bridge and the Manchester Ship Canal. By 1867, the Armstrong Company had begun to build iron warships, and in the first 15 years they built 20. And in the last quarter of the last century, you know, they became like world leaders in armaments and warship building. By this time he'd become a lord, and he'd also become a great landowner. And this here is his parlour, you know, very beautiful, and he must have made a lot of money. And here he entertained foreign envoys and princes who'd all come down to have a look at his big guns, you know. And of course, at first he was very patriotic. He only sold them to the British government, but they terminated his contract, and then he threw patriotism through the window and started selling them to everybody all over the world, and became the greatest armament supplier of the time.
What Fred grasped is that you don't have to throw out the whole of Victorian culture and deride all of its achievements simply because there are some aspects of it which, perhaps for good reasons, we would find politically incorrect or unpleasant or difficult to deal with now. I mean, I think he grasped that it was one of the most creative cultures that there has ever been, and I think he grasped that that was a unique historical achievement that Victorian Britain produced, and that if there are nasty sides to it along the way, there was appalling poverty in those cities, that actually the Industrial Revolution wouldn't have happened without them, and it doesn't mean that it wasn't a great achievement.
By the 1890s, the manufacture of arms and battleships had become one of our major industries. Armstrong had turned a brilliantly successful engineering works into a symbol of imperial might. Here at this spot, you know, down there they made all the battleships, and up there kept extending and extending all the way to the Scots woodworks. In fact, in my shed I've got a riveting hammer that says, Sir W.G. Armstrong, Scots Woodworks, Newcastle on Tyne. So I know they made riveting hammers up there. What an empire it must have been.
I mean, it's lovely to think of the Victorian age as a heroic age. It wasn't always a heroic age for the people involved, and he understood that and made it clear that there was real hardship in sort of running a steam engine sort of perfectly for hour upon hour, or being on the locomotive going up to Scotland, you know, with hardly any protection at all, and having to spot every signal, you know, sort of come rain, come shine. You know, these were very demanding jobs that people had, and I think he understood that.
Fred has a very strong understanding of the traditions of the Victorian Industrial Revolution, and one of the great underpinnings of that was this idea of self-help, that you could, if you worked hard enough, you would be able to achieve anything that you wanted. It wasn't always easy, there were sacrifices to be made, but he knew that a good day's work for a good day's pay was the best way in which you could live your life.
I think Fred's contribution to understanding the great engineers is, in a sense, overshadowed by his ability that he's got people to understand the unknown engineers, you know, the riveters and the blacksmiths and the people who really did it. And there was this sense that, yeah, the Victorians, they saw things going wrong in their world, but they also felt that they were working towards a new era of peace and prosperity, and somehow all the things that were wrong, like slums or illness or whatever, would ultimately be swept away by material advancement. And that sense of optimism, which we've so lost. We now know that imperialism has all these problems, that industrialization brings global warming and pollution. And he was looking back to that world where people, you know, believed in what they were doing passionately and were trying and believed they were making things better.
I think really I'd have been an happy man then, you know, putting all the poverty and you know, awful things that there were in the Victorian period aside. You know, I think if you were a mechanical bent, you could survive then, you know, like, I reckon I'd have been all right. I don't think I'd have been out of work.